Good evening and welcome to the It's All Greek to Me blog tour. I'm Dr. Paul Kiritsis and this is blog number 27. This blog is something of a prelude to next week's lessons, which will be about the Gnostic religion. We start off with mythology, a general description of mythology, though we move into Gnostic mythology a bit towards the end of the blog. Choosing to contemporize, reconstruct, retell, or interpret any ancient myth, particularly fragments of universally recognized mythological discourses such as Homer's The Iliad and Odyssey, or Hesiod's Theogony, can be for the most part an incredibly daunting and hair-raising experience. Yet for any writer who intuitively penetrates the dark veil of entertainment or explanatory devices and sees myth as a primal mover in the narrative or storytelling process, for any writer who can acknowledge its intrinsic powers in reshaping and recasting the cosmic clay which forms the mold of knowledge, the cultural attitudes, behaviours and values of any society, as well as any political ramifications that may ensue as a result, retelling these extraordinarily powerful and timeless stories somehow mimics a thermometer which measures and reflects the increment and nature of our collective consciousness, and acts as a necessary precursor to our evolutionary leap in critical thinking, inquiry, and the way we process and evaluate information as a whole. But before we go on to my preferred choice of subject, it is necessary to define the physiology, the internal components or stuff of what might be defined as myth. Strictly speaking, myths are sacred and timeless stories that attempt to make sense of an otherwise confusing and chaotic information universe. They also define and delineate the central self from the unconsciousness matrix, illuminate the relationship between the microcosm of the self and the macrocosm of the greater cosmos, recounting events pertaining to the origins and functions of the universe and all things living or inanimate contained within it. Most of the questions inexplicably linked with myth are abstract, philosophical in nature, and highly resistant to localization in the three-dimensional corporeal vacuum of time and space. You may think of myth consciousness as a baby struggling to make sense of its immediate environment, despite its own hopeless state of passivity in a world of meaningless associations. Information processing belonging to this level of evolving intelligence would inevitably come up with the following questions. Who am I? Who are we? How did I come to be? What is the world? How did it come to be? Who created it? And what are the moral, social codes of conduct that govern our behavior in society as a whole? What are the consequences of lawmaking and law breaking? The word mythos itself is derived from the Greek mythos, a term which denotes word or story. It appears that the pre-Socratic philosophers only referenced it in passing, and the concept didn't really come to eminence in the intellectual world until the life and times of Plato, who perceived it to be a literary vehicle encapsulating allegorical truth, for example, the mythos of Atlantis. The Platonic and Neoplatonic schools of thought were inextricably linked with the exploration of reality, dividing the cosmos into the eternal world of being, which encompassed the intellect, divine forms and ideas, and the ever-fluctuating, temporal and chaotic world of becoming. It goes without saying that Platonic thought flirted openly with the psychological, ahistorical approach to mythography, though little to no attention has been given to the hermeneutics of myth until well into the 19th century. At about this time, Sir James Frazer published The Golden Bough, a quasi-anthropological work defining mythological discourse as a preserved body of oral folklore which embodied the unconscious projections of pastoral dilemmas and traditions. Emerging in the 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung and Sigmund Freud took a more holistic approach and saw myths as exploration of psychological terrain in which archetypal content of the human psyche emerged from the unconscious, subsequently forging dynamic relationships with one another and with the macrocosm at large. Joseph Campbell, the author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, took the psychoanalytic point of view a step further and professed that the characters of myth and dream were urgent heroes who embarked on a long journey, underwent a struggle of some sort, and successfully emerged from it enlightened and anew, with a refined, resilient, and an altogether more evolved identity. On the polar end of this hermeneutical scale sat French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who rejected the psychological internalization of myth for a more impersonal model, emphasizing narrative strategy and plot device as the bone which formed the skeletal framework of all stories. be they compelling fiction or dramatic non-fiction. My purpose here is not to analyse the scope of hermeneutical interpretation that has typified the study of mythography over the last few centuries, but to give a millisecond flash, a fleeting glimpse, if you like, of the onion-skinned layers composing the mythological sphere. In this way, readers may garner a greater appreciation of its interdisciplinary, multifaceted nature. Thus, when entering the labyrinth of mythology, one must tread along the winding passages which harness a worm's eye view of political, social, literary, performative, textual, psychological, astronomical, seasonal, and structural aspects, but he or she must never lose sight of the bird's eye view, an impartial trajectory which succeeds in taking all into account without becoming localized. Sadly, it appears that contemporary Western society is very eclectic when it comes to choice of subject. Most academics and students harbour an unconscious bias for Greek, Roman and Norse myths. If one elects to study mythology at tertiary level, they'll be surprised to find the subject reader askew with a profusion of classical texts. This lopsided representation of a universal phenomenon precludes mention of mythographical landscape from the primitive religions of Africa, South America and Australia, which are hardly, if ever, included in the syllabus plan. Even Egyptian and Gnostic mythologians have been largely ignored until now. The latter of these are especially significant, seeing that they're the only surviving totems of heterogeneous religious communities that flourished between the 2nd and the 3rd centuries of the Common Era. These were peoples united by an ascetic way of life and a conviction that religious, spiritual insights pertaining to the nature of the cosmos, or gnosis, as it would have been called then, could only be arrived at through revelation. Only revelation could draw to oneself an experiential knowledge of reality that exceeded and was far superior to reason alone. Perhaps this distinct religious mentality is epitomized best by the second tractate of Codex 9 of the Nag Hammadi Library, the Christian Gnostic Testimony of Truth, which asserts that when man comes to know himself and God, who is over the truth, he will be saved, and he will crown himself with the crown unfading. While being the only avenue to salvific knowledge, Gnosis was also of a highly esoteric in nature, and therefore inaccessible to the unsophisticated majority. The Gnostics proceeded to estrange their contemporaries further by professing that all other avenues of knowledge, available, rational, philosophical or otherwise, were no more than the well-concealed and cleverly devised machinations of an evil demiurge or creator demon named Yaldabaoth that was bent on destroying the soul sparks of God's favoured creatures. No doubt these sentiments would have done little to attract devotees to its divine mysteries. A systematic examination of the authentic Gnostic writings reveals to us that the Gnostic sects probably arrived at their morally righteous and inflexible convictions through a severe radicalization of ideas that were themselves derived from biblical wisdom literature, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology. Ironically, an elitist mentality, which included an outright rejection of all other forms of knowing on their part, alienated contemporaneous religious currents, for example, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Judaism, that were underpinned by the same fundamental belief in God's absolute transcendence. Later still, when the patriarchal sects began to demarcate the variegated world of collective Christian beliefs and imbue it with their Iron Age attitudes, the Gnostic religion and its mythological variants were branded heretical, and drastic measures were taken to ensure its suppression.